Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It is such a beautiful night to be here with all of you on Columbia Point. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, and on behalf of all of my Library and Foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are here with us tonight and who are watching online. I'd like to start by acknowledging the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, as well as the Mass Cultural Council and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. We're fortunate to be joined tonight by so many of our generous supporters. Thank you to Stephen Smith, President Kennedy's nephew, members of our board of directors and advisors who offer us their guidance and wise counsel. And thank you to our donors and New Frontier members who carry forward President Kennedy's ideals in our modern life. This evening, our archivists have put together a display in the lobby featuring materials from our archives on the Kennedy administration's efforts to reduce discrimination against women in the workplace. I hope those of you who are here tonight will stop by to view these documents that help tell our nation's history. We gather today at a time in our country when every day feels consequential. Headlines scream, the internet pulses, rallies grow, courts are inundated by legal questions that could define who we are as a nation for generations to come, and the world watches. For many of us, it's hard to imagine a more significant time in the United States, and perhaps there isn't. But as President Kennedy noted in his inaugural address, it's history that will be the final judge of our times. And so it's in this spirit that I want to offer a little history lesson and take us back for a moment to 3 days in 1963. June 9th, 10th, and 11th of that year are often cited as not only the most consequential days of John F. Kennedy's presidency, but as historian Peniel Josephson called them, the 3 days in 1963 that are still changing America. Ambassador Caroline Kennedy wasn't able to be with us today, but she has spoken movingly of these 3 days and what they meant for her father. Here is her summary of what happened that week. It was a few months after the Cuban Missile Crisis and at a critical moment for the civil rights movement after the Birmingham riots. On June 9th, President Kennedy spoke to the Conference of Mayors in Honolulu, Hawaii, about the most urgent issue of the time, civil rights. He made clear that the moral and constitutional crisis of civil rights had to be solved by the citizens and their leaders in communities across the United States. The federal government would help, he said, but the final responsibility will rest with you as mayors at the local level. The next day, on June 10th, he gave perhaps the most important speech of his presidency. In a commencement address at American University, he set forth a strategy of peace. Drawing on the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he called upon the Soviet Union to join the United States in negotiating comprehensive nuclear disarmament. 2 months later, with Britain and the USSR, he would sign the Limited Test Ban Treaty banning atmospheric testing, the proudest achievement of his presidency. The next morning, on June 11th, in violation of a federal court order, Governor George Wallace made his famous stand in the schoolhouse door to block Black students from desegregating the University of Alabama. President Kennedy mobilized the federal government and forced him to back down. That night, he spoke to the nation from the Oval Office, putting the full force of his administration behind the cause of civil rights. He announced legislation which would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964 after his assassination. It was in this context, on June 10th, sandwiched in between his seminal call for world peace and historic stand on Black civil rights, that President Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act of 1963, giving women their greatest victory since suffrage in 1920. Perhaps you, like me, were surprised to learn that the Equal Pay Act was signed 62 years ago under the Kennedy administration. That might be because it's often regulated to a footnote in the description of these 3 days. It's virtually never listed in the pantheon of crowning achievements of President Kennedy's 1,000 days of office. It wasn't a priority initiative of any of his top officials. And while President Kennedy saw addressing the status of women as necessary in demonstrating the superiority of democracy to a world on the brink, he did not see it as the main battle to be won. And so how was it passed, you may wonder, without the full strength of the administration behind it? Well, it was passed not through the strength of the administration, but through the strength of the women's movement and the labor movement, and one woman in particular, Esther Peterson, who used her role in the administration to bring all of those things together. In 1961, President Kennedy appointed the AFL-CIO's chief women lobbyist, Esther Peterson, as director of the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor. At Peterson's urging, he also established the President's Commission on the Status of Women. Although there were some late 19th century legislation protecting women's labor, it was weak and rarely enforced. A 1945 Women's Equal Pay Act failed to pass in Congress. By 1963, Peterson had become the Assistant Secretary of Labor, the highest-ranking woman in JFK's administration. She and other women in the labor movement lobbied Congress until they finally took up consideration of the bill. In the spring of 1963, as Congress considered the bill, average women's pay was 60% of average men's pay. The Senate passed the bill on May 17th, the House passed it on May 23rd, and President Kennedy signed it into law on June 10th, 1963. It was a significant achievement, deeply impacting over 50% of the US population. But when President Kennedy signed it into law, he noted that it was just a first step. And when an interviewer asked Esther Peterson in 1970 if she was satisfied with the way the bill came out, she said, "Well, no, you see," she continued, "I wanted it to come out as we got it out of committee, and it ended up not as strong. But I think the big thing is that it did push equal pay along a lot. There's a law now, and it's beginning to take hold. You know, you don't get all you want. You take one good, giant step, and it establishes the principle, and then you've got to build on that." And she was right. Change doesn't start or end with the stroke of a president's pen. Change happens in the hard, unsung work of people committed to progress. Legislators and governors, mayors and town councils, judges and unions, and most often than not, just regular people like Esther Peterson asking what they can do to build a more just world. Today, 62 years later, the wage gap has narrowed from 59 cents on the dollar in 1963, but women still only earn 84 cents on the dollar in 2024. And it's important to note that that gap is even wider for women of color. Equal pay remains a part of the unfinished business of this country, the ongoing fight to realize America's promise of freedom and justice for all. There are many people today, and many who couldn't join us, who have taken up this torch and are pushing for wage equity today. We're honored to have Meredith Tuitt, chairwoman of the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women, and Chrissy Lynch, president of the Massachusetts AFL-CIO, joining us today. And we are deeply honored to welcome our special guest speaker, U.S. House of Representatives Democratic Whip Katherine Clark, to the Kennedy Library this evening. Whip Clark has been a champion of working families and especially working women for her entire career. Since her first term in Congress, she's been a strong advocate for supporting and expanding access to quality, affordable child care around the country. Whip Clark's efforts to expand child care subsidies and workforce development opportunities for child care professionals and to improve the quality of care for infants and toddlers are a hallmark of her steadfast advocacy on behalf of America's working women. Since 2013, Whip Clark has proudly represented Massachusetts' 5th District in the House. In the fall of 2022, she was elected by her colleagues to serve as Democratic Whip, the second most senior position of the House Democratic Caucus. One of only 2 women to ever serve as whip, she currently has the distinction of being the highest-ranking woman in Congress. I'm also delighted to welcome Errin Haines, our moderator for this evening, back to the Kennedy Library. Errin is editor-at-large and founding mother of The 19th, a nonprofit independent newsroom focused on the intersection of gender, politics, and policy, where she is also author of the Amendment newsletter and host of the podcast of the same name. She also serves as an MSNBC political contributor. Prior to joining the 19th, she was a national writer on race and ethnicity for the Associated Press and has also worked at the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and the Orlando Centennial. She has served 2 terms as Vice President of Print for the National Association of Black Journalists. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Wow. Well, I mean, what a time to be here. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Rachel, for that kind introduction. And welcome, Whip Clark. It is really good to be with you in these consequential times. And just listening to Rachel kind of recount those 3 days, before the Equal Pay Act was passed, it feels like this could be a week that we just witnessed that could well change America as well. So thinking about the role of mayors, of governors, of elected officials, including, yes, indeed, the president, have come into sharp relief, yes. I would say, in recent days. We're here to talk about rights and expanding equality. Rachel talked about President Kennedy as somebody who also mobilized the National Guard, but in defense of protecting rights and expanding equality. And so, for us to have a conversation about really the unfinished business of the Equal Pay Act and also of the 19th Amendment feels very, very prescient. So before we get to the Equal Pay Act, obviously I would be remiss if I did not ask you about the events of last week, recent events. And so let's talk about that a little bit if we can. I'll start, I guess, in Los Angeles with the unrest that we saw there last week. And I'm wondering what you think about the unilateral deployment of federal troops by the president to Los Angeles over the objection of state leadership. Do you feel like that amounts to a constitutional crisis?
That term is getting used so frequently now. It's almost beginning to lose its meaning, but we cannot lose track of it. And I love the way you have framed this conversation, that this is equal pay, equal rights, civil rights. This is part of our unfinished work and journey in this country. Yeah. And I think one of the things that has been a hallmark of all times where we have strife that results in progress is that people protest. Yeah. And we certainly saw it this past Saturday when we had 5 million people around the country come out and peacefully, almost, our hearts grieve for someone in Salt Lake City, but 5 million people almost without incident. And that is such a stark relief to a president who illegally sent the National Guard into a state that the governor was not requesting, did not want, the mayor did not ask for, to suppress speech, not to enable people to protest and make progress. The exact opposite of what we saw, suppressing violence so that people could speak. This was suppressing relatively peaceful protests in order to make sure there was compliance with the president's ideology. And then calling in the Marines, I think, is a further step into not only creating a distraction from political issues he is having with this bill that we'll talk about in the budget, but also a step towards creating a military that is a police force for the president. And so these are 2 very dangerous steps that were taken last week, and one that I am so proud of our communities across Massachusetts and across the country, that the answer was this huge peaceful protest. And we all have a role to play in this time, and it's the only answer to it, is to continue to come together in community, to continue to lift people up, and continue to make those ideals that we talk about equality and justice, come to life. And we have that power, and we have to remember it and use our voice for it.
Yeah. We've seen so many millions of Americans, to your point, across the country doing that. Started in Los Angeles, but then as other cities began to join in solidarity with Los Angeles, even heading into Saturday, when you saw millions of people taking to the streets in towns, small towns and big cities, raising their voices and saying, as the president tries to define a certain, what he wants America to be, you have millions of Americans saying, no, this is who we want to be. And that feels like a really important thing to mark in this already, I know you talk about overused words, unprecedented is another word, right? But truly, the response of the American people apparently may also turn out to be unprecedented. We saw the president in recent days posting on social media that he wanted to specifically target Democratic controlled cities with Democratic mayors. Do you feel like, him using military force in Los Angeles and now mentioning other cities that have Democratic mayors, do you feel like that is him punishing blue cities for their immigration stances, and what precedent does that set?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is part of the danger of this time, is using where you got votes, not to go back and say, I'm going to work harder and show these communities that I represent them, but to say I'm going to make their lives miserable. Mm-hmm. And I am going to focus on places that I did not win in an election. And forget that you're president of the United States and you took an oath of office to uphold the Constitution that applies to every American and gives us all rights that he cannot take away by fiat or executive order. And that is what he is trying to impose. And that is why I do find hope in that we are seeing Americans not only turn out and protest, but we're seeing special elections start to flip seats that have long been deep in Trump country. We are seeing Americans come together and support litigation, upholding, bringing it to the courts, and that the courts overall are holding strong, and that we have to believe in those institutions. Part of this strategy of chaos is to keep us off balance and keep us doubting and feel like it is all out of our hands. He is unstoppable and is going to be able to do whatever he wants. And we are seeing these symbols that are so important and these victories in our courts, in elections that have happened since November, in the ability of people coming together and saying, this is a time where we double down on our constitutional rights. This is a time where we stand together neighbor to neighbor and create the communities that we want and that we envision, and to keep making progress, because the whole design is to make us fearful and intimidated and scared and angry and therefore ineffective. And that's where these divisive myths of the other that is taking from you, when we see the play in they put it all out there.
Yes.
And when we see this budget that takes away health care from 16 million Americans, when we see food programs like Meals on Wheels and school lunches and SNAP being ripped away from millions of Americans, historical cuts, all for tax breaks for the very, very wealthiest in this country. And then we say to the generations behind us, and we're putting this on the credit card for you to pay off. Yeah. That is not even working for the top 1%. That's for the 0.6, the 900 billionaires in this country. And that is a stake that all of us have to stand up against with every tool that we have, because this piece of legislation tells us all we need to know about this administration's vision. It is to make the winner's circle so small and to make sure that people don't have opportunity. And the very people who are working hard and not making it, working hard, paying their taxes, 60% of American households do not feel they are able to provide the basics.
Yeah.
And if we continue on this wealth disparity, and if they go forward with the largest transfer of wealth in our country's history in this one bill, that is going to have an impact for generations that will far outlive this president and his presidency.
Yeah, you know, listening to you, I'm reminded of Coretta Scott King, who, though she was not married to an elected official, also lost her husband to political violence. And she talked about the violence of not doing more around poverty and equality. Yeah. And that is a kind of violence that I think it is important for us to name. If I can just ask you, you know, you talk about the threat to our Constitution, the threat to, you know, folks as they are trying to raise their voices. I'm wondering what Congress is prepared to do if the executive branch continues to do things like bypass governors and mayors to crack down on protests, especially in these Democratic-led cities.
Yeah, listen, we have to do everything we can and use every tool we have. And, you know, Washington, D.C. is a winner-take-all system. So when you have the gavels, well, I should say when you lose the gavels, we lose the ability to subpoena. We lose the ability to call witnesses and have that accountability, which is a huge part of our responsibility. And we lose the ability to have full leverage over the budget process. And what we are seeing is a Republican Party that is just getting in line. They'll write letters saying, I can't stand with these Medicaid cuts. They will have too much of an impact on my Republican district. But then they vote yes. What they'll tell you in private conversations about their misgivings about stripping away Medicaid and the impact, it will be rural hospitals that will close first. Our hospital system, healthcare system in Massachusetts will also be jeopardized. But rural hospitals, rural nursing homes that are so dependent on Medicaid, all of this is going to close first. And once it's closed, very, very difficult to bring back.
Yes.
We can't just toggle our economy and these institutions on and off. But these conversations that I may have with a colleague from across the aisle in the elevator, it matters how you vote. And so Congress has our job to keep pushing in every way we can. And it starts with working with our Democratic AGs and amazing outside groups like Democracy Forward in bringing the litigation, not allowing one of these executive orders to go unanswered. And then it moves on to doing every tool we have. If we can't get the hearings, we've started having get the witnesses at the hearings we want. We've started having our own series of hearings. And we started them in Washington, and now we're moving them across the country so that people can see and hear a different perspective in a place where maybe their member isn't talking to them or not giving them the straight facts, or maybe they've just gotten tired of the political process in its entirety. But if you're in their hometown They just might come by and listen to a new way of thinking about it and hear their community members. We're doing town halls in Democratic districts, but also in red districts, wherever we can, to make sure we're making those connections. I'm on my way on Wednesday to go to Marks, Mississippi, and hold a town hall there. To make sure that we are hearing and listening to the American people, as well as sharing in part of this, because it is that mobilization. It is a member of Congress's ability to convene and to put out information and to work with communities in our districts and around the country that is perhaps our greatest tool we have in the minority. And when we can do a procedural move or something that actually can disrupt and stop, we're going to use those as well. But they're limited. And our real power comes from enabling and empowering those in our community and giving them not only the warnings, but also the hope of the way forward, and all eyes on winning the midterms and making sure that we get those gavels back in the House so we can have the ability to shape budgets, to get back to doing what's fair for the American people and families, and to have the accountability and subpoena power.
I'm actually very interested to see, especially how all of this energy that we're seeing, with the American people in the streets, how that does translate to the ballot box next year. Because if we see that kind of energy, I think that could certainly bode well for Democrats. I take your point about showing up and supporting folks, but I know there are so many of the voters that I talk to who are wanting to see Democrats fighting, Democrats pushing back against what we're seeing. I mean, we saw the tragedy that just happened in Minnesota. A sitting state house leader assassinated in her own home. I want to know if you think that right-wing extremism, that rhetoric that we're seeing, we know that contributes to acts of political terror, but shouldn't that be called out more forcefully by name?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you are, every Democrat I know is calling that out. And not only using their communities, but really trying to use every form of communication that we have. Because we do have to name it. We have to name it if we are going to get people to stand up. And we have to be somewhat fearless about it, because there is so much of this is meant to intimidate and back down. And if they will push a US Senator out of a press conference for trying to ask a question in a federal building where he has an office, throw him on the floor and handcuff him, imagine what they'll do to your family when the cameras aren't on, when you're not a sitting member of Congress or the US Senate. And that is the real fear of all of this. So each of us, but especially members of Congress, have to use every tool we have, communicate in every form of media that we have, and to be out there with people in community as well. Because we have to use every tool at our disposal to make sure that we continue to highlight and fight back, and also give people hope that they can do this, because the power lies with the people. There's never truly been power in Washington that has made progress and changed. It is with the people in our neighborhoods where this revolution is going to come from.
Yeah, and this is meant to have a chilling effect. And so folks knowing that there is strength in numbers and that the truth is being said out loud, I think goes a long way. I wonder if you feel like the federal government is doing enough to protect elected officials from political violence.
Well, we're having a lot of discussions about that, and obviously it is of great concern.
Yes, because we know it's gendered as well.
And it's very gendered, and also against people of color in Congress. Like everywhere in our society, it impacts women and women of color at alarming rates. And we've seen a huge change in the threat levels against elected officials, and certainly members of Congress are no exception. But political violence will end up in all of our communities. And my real fear of this is that left unchecked, left unspoken and named, this is how it spreads into far beyond elected officials.
Yeah.
And so we all have to stand up in this moment and not tolerate the sort of rhetoric that we're hearing, even as Minnesota grieves for a beloved leader. You know, to have the President of the United States continue to name call and badmouth a grieving governor is something that we all have to name and object to and decry in the strongest terms that we have.
Yeah. And you have a very strong platform to do that, as was mentioned, most powerful woman in our politics right now, second-ranking Democrat in the House. What are you telling your colleagues? What do you say to the country, to the folks here in the audience, to the people here who are watching, about how to defend democracy right now?
Yeah. The number one thing I say to my colleagues who know it, but sometimes need a reminder, and certainly to everyone in this country, is know the power of your voice. Know the power of it. It is how we have always made progress. It is how we have defended rights. It is how we got the pay equity in 1963, and it is how we are going to continue that progress. We have not had a very easy time for women in this country in the last 3 years. We have seen our health care be taken apart, dismantled, and it's far beyond reproductive care. It is not just abortion care. It is going into the fact that in 1/3 of all our counties now, there's no obstetric care.
Yeah.
There's no place to have a healthy baby, to get, you know, prenatal and postnatal care. And so what are we doing?
Yeah.
And in this most recent bill, one of the things they changed that didn't get a lot of attention because it was very last minute was saying that insurance providers in 12 states that require insurers to cover abortion care, like Massachusetts, you can no longer participate on the ACA marketplace. So either forcing states or insurance companies to give up that coverage so they can remain providing coverage in the marketplace. And just this systematic attack on women's health, and leaving the Pay Equity Act that we have passed 4 times during Democratic majorities in the House, twice since I've been there, still hanging in the Senate, blocked by the filibuster. And all of these pieces, whether it's health care, pay equity, family leave, being able to have paid sick leave, and certainly being able to have help with the outrageously high cost of childcare.
Yes.
All of these pieces are necessary for women's economic strength.
Absolutely. And full participation, frankly, in this democracy and society,
Right.
I would add. You're singing my song over at the 19th. We cover all of these issues, as you well know. So I want to shift now to the original topic of tonight's conversation. But before I do, I just want to, looking out into the audience, I'm wondering how many of you in the room tonight, or your mothers or your grandmothers, lives were changed by the Equal Pay Act. Just show of hands. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Wow. And I ask that because I just really want to encourage everybody here tonight and watching to share your stories about that with the people in your lives. They need to know. I mean, Whip Clark was just talking about the power of your voice. This is history that is living among us, right? This is not ancient history. There are people alive today that were impacted by that legislation. And we would do well to remember that fight and to recognize that that is a fight that continues today, right? Which brings us to this part of the conversation. So I know that you have been leading the push for a lot of these issues. The Paycheck Fairness Act comes to mind in the House. What is the core principle really that drives your work on equal pay? How do you see its urgency as we are marking this anniversary of the Equal Pay Act?
Yeah, I mean, it all ties in to equality. It all ties into having women, as you said, be able to fully participate in our economy, in their family life, in our democracy, in our institutions, as voters, in every possible way. And what we are seeing from our, from this particular moment we're in, all of that is being dragged backwards. Yes. But we also haven't made the progress we needed to make long before Donald Trump got anywhere near Pennsylvania Avenue. And so we own that as well. Mm-hmm. And we have to look at not one piece of legislation. When I ran for Congress, I said the first bill I'm going to co-sponsor is the Pay Equity Act. And that was because it just stands for so much. Mm-hmm. If you are unwilling to pay women equal pay for equal work, how can they ever find true equality and a foothold in this economy? And really, there is no freedom without that. Yes. And so, is one bill going to bring equality to women? No. But it is a series of understanding that we have created an economic system that has systematically devalued women's work, what we consider traditional women's work, and especially for women of color. Yes. That is just work that they should be doing for us. And the pay doesn't matter, the benefits don't matter, the hours don't matter. And that's why we're so grateful to have leaders like Chrissy at the, leading the AFL and unions that make sure that all workers have rights. And for me, it comes down in any political campaign. And the reason I got into this job, after giving a very cogent argument on why I would never run for Congress, and then announce 6 weeks later, I blame a lot of it on Nikki Songus, who I called, and she had been the first woman to serve in Massachusetts in decades. And I called her and I said, I'm thinking about this, but I'm really not sure. I will be the most junior person in the minority, and Congress seems pretty broken. And that was 12 years ago. Yeah. So put that in context. Maybe I was onto something, but Nikki said to me, and it really sticks with me to this day, that the power of this job is being able to put something small. If you're not looking for having to have your name at the top of a bill, but put a piece in a budget that's moving, or another bill that is passing, that it may look small, but can impact millions of people for the better. Now that seemed a good way to spend your time, to be able to be that voice for people and keep moving us forward. And pay equity just seemed to me to be one of those fundamental issues. If we couldn't agree that we should pay people the same amount, and not have something like we got rid of in Lilly Ledbetter when she came forward with her suit in that case, and eventually the Lilly Ledbetter law and act, where you have 180 days to bring us, that's your statute of limitations. All of these things are still so stacked against women and giving them economic freedom and power. And we're not going to say that all outcomes are going to be the same, but let's give people a start at the same starting line. And let's make sure that those sort of issues of justice and equality are ones that we're tackling in real ways. And pay equity just is one of those that we've made strides in 1963. It is long past time to revisit it.
Yeah, well, just listening to you now, it just underscores the value of lived experience and identity, and how you bring that to policy, how that can show up in policy, that was one of your priorities as soon as you took office. I think Had you not come in the package that you came in, that might not have been a priority for you. That might not have been something that you've seen and that you continue to champion today. And so I continue to say representation matters. And also when you have, I mean, we're talking about more than half the population here, right? That we're having a conversation about them being paid equally in the year of our Lord 2025 seems a bit ridiculous. So. You mentioned, kind of some of the intersectionality around this conversation. We know that the pay gap widens, as you mentioned, when race or gender or disability or even caregiving are kind of overlapping factors. I want to know how you're thinking about how policy can address those intersectional layers of discrimination.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking pay equity, that's pay equity for everybody.
Yeah.
And we know that there are certain jobs, and let's go back to childcare. There are certain jobs that have become, it has become routine and acceptable that they are low-paying jobs.
Yeah. Went from essential just a few years ago to
essential.
That was on the radar at one point as an essential
We had this brief
role.
moment during the pandemic when there was a recognition that the work that overwhelmingly is done by women and overwhelmingly done by women of color is the work that is upholding all other work.
Yes.
And, it was the promise of President Kennedy after he signed this, hallmark legislation, that childcare was going to be next. And we just have never come back to that. And what we're seeing now is a dismantling of Head Start and threatening childcare and childcare subsidies, which states and families desperately need the federal partner in this.
Another determinant to whether a woman is able to participate in the workforce, right? If the child care piece is not solved.
We need to do both things. We need to pay the overwhelmingly female workforce a fair rate of pay. They're one of the only professions that look to teachers as having the golden goose, and like, if I could only get into the public school and that pay rate, I will really have made it. Like, we have to bring their pay up and at the same time help parents be able to find and afford quality childcare. And this is great for the economy. It is great for kids. And we know that when kids have, especially low-income kids, are able to get into a great childcare program, it sets them up for a lifetime of success. And the data is there, the science is there, we just need the political will to connect the dots.
You make such a good point about the need for political will, which also, from my perspective as a journalist, it means that we also need narrative change around this to start to generate for people why this matters, why they should care, why they should get involved. Like I said, just a few years ago, teachers, caregivers, essential workers, that is not the conversation that we are having around that workforce today. And I just wonder how you see kind of the most significant obstacles, whether they're political or economic or ideological, to really passing stronger equal pay laws, and how your caucus is trying to build consensus.
We have just run straight into the filibuster every time we've tried to do it, which is a whole nother topic of discussion.
Sure, we don't have another act.
Which, from a House perspective, I'm like, get your act together, Senate. We're going to. That's something we have to discuss because it's a Senate rule. It is not law. It is not part of our Constitution. And yes, it is bad as we are now when you're in the minority and you don't have that ability to block things and get an extra 10 senators to sort of give you a barrier. But that's the way our system is designed. And I think that part of the political moment we're in is that people don't see progress.
Right.
Because things like the Pay Equity Act pass the House and then die in the Senate. And so they begin to think, what difference does it make who we elect? Because it never gets over the finish line. And meanwhile, I'm falling farther and farther behind. So we have to look at the rules of our institutions and how we push things forward. And that when we have that power, that we act on behalf of people and communities. And that's how we can truly earn the trust back of people, so they elect people who are working with them towards these fundamental issues of how we can freely participate in our economy.
Yeah, I hear you. Midterms are still a while away, and so I'm wondering, in the meantime, what your message would be in terms of, employers are also part of this, and I'm also old enough to remember when employers were reckoning too with many things, and among the things they might have been reckoning with were how to change some of these things in recognition of some of those workers and what they would need to fully participate in the workforce, equally participate. What practical steps can employers, especially mid-sized businesses, take to make progress on the pay equity issue right now?
Transparency is a great thing. And I'm very grateful to our governor here and the legislature for the work they've done, that we now have a really solid pay equity law that could be a model that we should use nationally.
Yeah, talk about that. I mean, it seems to be a foundational tool, this issue of pay transparency. So how do you ensure that it's implemented effectively?
Yeah, I mean, that's, why we have courts and legislatures, and it is really about, but if you don't live in Massachusetts, there's a lot businesses can do about transparency around what people are getting paid, and just making sure that you have good policies and that you are aware of it. And we are now in this, I think you called it a period of exclusion and erasure.
Yes.
And
thank you for remembering that.
Yes. And so what we are seeing are this sort of pullback in order to stay below the radar of this administration and what may happen to you. We're seeing DEI programs being dropped. We're seeing lists appearing at, I'm so proud I get to represent so many of universities and colleges in my district, and they all got a list of words that they are no longer to use in research.
I hear some of you, maybe you all are familiar with some of those words.
And I know that I won't out the name of the university in my, but it's a smaller one, and they said, well, I guess we are going to change all of our research that's on the impact of whatever for men and women, because women's a banned word now. So
we're going to say it here. It's okay.
Men and non-men. And I'm like, okay, so all us non-men. And then I immediately thought about Nancy Mace and her obsession. I'm like, well, we could change all the women's room to non-men, and then we could solve all her problems right there with that.
That's true. I look forward to that proposal. Let us know at the 19th when that's coming. So we are talking about, more than half the population. I want to ask you a question about the other half, and how you see men's advocacy is really part of the solution here on pay equity. How do we get more men, and thank you to all of you who are in the room here tonight on this issue, to advance the issue of pay fairness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that families get it.
Yeah.
I think the families understand that if their spouse, their mom, their daughter is not paid fairly, if she doesn't have a fair shot at making it and providing for her family, that it doesn't go well for anybody. And, I hear from so many grandparents and grandfathers who are so worried about their adult children, and they just don't know how they're going to make it. And so I think we have to lean into that. This is This is a fundamental issue for our economy. It's a fundamental issue of civil rights, and that impacts everyone. And we have to push against this very real rhetoric that is being advanced in this country, that we can't all move forward, that is reserved for those who already have great privilege and wealth. And they're the ones who need to retain that. And everybody else has to work for them. Mm-hmm. And that is a very real, and setting ourselves up, whether it's women or immigrants or people of color, as the other that is taking from you, so that you don't notice that it's a very small group of incredibly powerful people that are taking from everybody and turning us against each other. So there is a real role for men in all of this.
Yeah.
And we have to continue to include them and set that expectation that, of course, they want to be part of the solution, because this is so good for their family.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and encouraging them to raise their voices too. I mean, certainly for us at the 19th, asking men about things, right? Because women are not just a special interest group. And also, you know, when you ask everyone about women's issues, they're no longer just women's issues. Women care about all the issues, and also you can ask everybody about everything, no matter who it affects, right?
That's right.
One more question before I go to some of the questions that the audience has submitted here. Let's imagine 5 years from now, if we can, if we all can. If you were reflecting at the 5-year mark, what are some of the concrete outcomes that you would hope to see in terms of pay equity, and what's the roadmap for us to get there?
Yeah, well, we have great legislation. We need to pass it. And we need to realize that part of women's economic power isn't going to come just from that. We need to do a whole bunch of bills. We need to have the paid sick leave. We need to address the cost of childcare. We are going to have to restore women's health rights in this country. And that is good for everybody. And the idea of, we recently, last week, with Senator Amy Klobuchar and I put together a special hearing on the impact on women of this budget bill. And one of the women who came to testify is a school bus driver and a single mom with 4 children. And she talked about she gets paid once a month and she doesn't make it to the end of the month. And so that last week, they're at their local food pantry. But she said, what gets me even to that 3rd week is a SNAP benefit,
yes,
which we are now looking at
eliminating,
taking away from her, as she works from driving a van to an actual bus, which she hopes to be paid equally for with all the other bus drivers. That goal will allow her to bring more money in to her family. And why would we take the rug out from under her for no purpose? She doesn't want to continue to rely on SNAP, but it is a lifeline,
a bridge,
as she works hard and is going for this other credential to be able to earn more money. And so we've got to look at all of these issues and how we want to make sure that people have a government that is responsive and works for them. There's plenty of efficiency that we can find in government, especially in updating technology and making it faster and more responsive and reducing errors in our system. Many of the errors we have that are being cited in our food programs, for example, are errors that they pay the recipient less than they are entitled to. So when you hear about error rates, we got to be really clear what we're talking about. And so let's improve our technology. Let's get rid of some of these legacy systems and really deliver government in a more efficient customer service way. But keep in mind that it is there for people who are working hard and paying their taxes. And that should be where the benefit is. When people hit a hard time, when they have a medical incident, when they have a job loss or some other impact in their life, there should be a way that not everything falls apart, and that people want to get back on their feet and be able to put their lives back together. And why wouldn't we do that? That is just so fundamentally against the role of government and the role that we should take to help lift people up when they need it and help them. But you never created a job by taking away someone's health care. You're not going to help this woman get to that next level she's striving for by taking away her food program. And the fact that this burden falls so heavily on single moms in our country is one that we have to be aware of and make sure that we are looking at a host of policies that return the focus to families and return that American dream that if you work hard and you are playing by the rules, you should be able to get ahead. And you certainly should be able to get by. But right now, people are looking, they're like, my kids, we're never going to be able to afford a house. We're not going to be able to have that job. I can't take care, if that nursing home closes, how will I ever have my mom back in our house and be responsible for her care? And so many women are balancing both of that.
Generation,
that sandwich generation, it's like, it's a grilled cheese because you get melted. There's nothing like, sandwiches always sound so cool to me, and like, you know, like refrigerated and crispy lettuce. And, you know, I had, you know, my mom had Alzheimer's, my dad had had a major stroke, and I had 3 school-age kids at home. It was hard. It was hard. And I had the ability, as a member of Congress, I had insurance, and I could say, I can't, you know, get there. I have to take my mom to an appointment. Most people don't have that. They don't have that. And the pressure it puts on them. And to somehow say, well, you're not deserving of something because of who you are, not the situation you're in. That's not the way we build a resilient economy. That's not the way we continue to be a preeminent economy in the globe. And it's not the way we live these values that we continue to strive for. So pay equity is one piece, but it sort of reflects all the work we need to do, and our hope that this work is going to make it easier for the next generation.
Well, here's hoping for a brighter future and a better outcome for that bus driver, that single mom. In 5 years, let's hope that she's attained her goals and that she had the help that she needed to get there. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience. If there are other audience questions, there are folks in the audience that can collect your cards, and maybe we'll have time to bring up a few more. Going back to the events of last week, Whip Clark, there's somebody who was wondering if the events of last week could potentially help to, are you already hearing, you know, among your colleagues on both sides of the aisle, could there be, you know, a common ground that folks are finding due to the events of last week that could provide a way forward? How are you hearing people talk about this? Do you see any kind of opportunity for consensus or progress in the wake of last week's tragedy?
It's questions like this why I think I'm no longer going to get invited to any dinner parties, because unfortunately, I am alarmed, and really, it's hard to even come up with the right word about where we are. You know, I think back, and I've told this story many times. I referenced it earlier, that when I came into Congress, I was it was a special election when Ed Markey became senator. So I knew that I was the most junior person in the minority party. And we have numbers on the back of our pins, our congressional pins, that tell you your exact number.
That's a nice reminder.
Yeah, so 435 members of the House, and I was number 474. So I'm still not sure how that happened.
I was like, what?
but
Congress math.
Yeah, Congress math,
Okay.
but I got the point about where I stood, and I think that the lesson of that time that I don't see today and really fills me with despair was that I was able. People at home didn't want to hear that you're 474, so wait 2 years and
Make it
hope
happen.
something works out for you, but. They wanted me to get to work.
Yes.
And it was around the opioid crisis that I found a lot of partners to work with. Mitch McConnell was my co-sponsor on the first bill I ever passed. And I worked with Republicans from Ohio and West Virginia and Kentucky because they were as ravaged as Massachusetts was. And we could find those ways to come together. And now there are opportunities, but they seem to fall apart when it matters. And in the first 100+ days of this administration, that is even more strained than it has ever been. And it is just, how do we find that? And we've got to keep searching for it, but it is discouraging on where we are. And just seeing people who go home and sort of preach moderation, and that they are always bragging about being one of the most bipartisan members of Congress, but it's like this bill and these other serious issues in front of us, they matter, and you are showing your values. And for me, it's like if being in Congress becomes all about getting reelected, just the actual reelection, not the work you're doing, it is time to go home. It's time to go home.
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably have an idea of what you might say to this next one, but I'm going to ask you anyway. And that is, to your point, you're having private conversations with your Republican colleagues, but what they're saying publicly, obviously, a very different thing. Question is, do you think that any of the Republicans will ever say enough is enough and stand up to the president? What would it take for that to happen?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we're not there yet, what it will take, but listen, despite my despair over where we are, and we have to continue to try and reach out for solutions, and not only be high contrast, but also put out our proactive vision of where we think, how concretely we can address the housing crisis, how we can address making sure everyone in this country has health care as a right and not a privilege, how we can start to turn back, how we protect women's health, how we protect our public schools and veterans' benefits, and how we make progress. How are we going to build a green economy? How are we going to address these issues around pay equity? Like, very concrete, and bring people with us into that. You can't always be no and against things. You have to be for something, and that has to be part of what we are doing. But we also have to make sure that if you will not join, if you do not have anything, if the sole concern is about the outcome of your primary, then we have to take away their electoral power. And that means working every day to reach out to disaffected voters, to reach out to people who are still trying to figure out, does this president just need more time to do the good things? Will these tariffs actually work in my way? And we have to take away the political power of people who are actively working against the American people in this time. And that is being good communicators and messengers and working every day to make sure that we win in the midterms. Not just to win, to have Democrats win, but because we have to be a stick in this spoke that is really destroying our democracy and the future for families.
You know, I think with all of the action that we've seen, you know, across the country among millions of Americans, you do have, you know, a significant part of the electorate that is wanting to do something, that is wanting to act. And so, you know, in the time we have left, I'm gonna do a twofer here, asking you know, what can individuals, especially women early in their careers, do to advocate for themselves and others when they're up against the systemic pay gap? A question from the audience is, what would you tell young women in high school and college to help them advocate for equal pay?
Know the power of your voice. So, like, it really does come back. And you said something earlier, Errin, about the power of story. And it is what I always tell people who come to DC, that, like, you make these budgets come alive. We may forget the intricacies of the SNAP program and the state share that they're changing, and, you know, the $313 billion that's even hard to take in, they're taking away. But I'm not gonna forget that school bus driver. I'm not gonna forget her. And I'm not going to forget the constituent Minerva from my district who said, where is the mercy in all of this? Where is the mercy? And this is what you know, the best thing about talking to young women, to talking to girls, is about, like, just know that you are complete. You don't have to be better. You don't have to work on anything. You are who you are, and know it, and throw your shoulders back and demand your rights. Demand what you are owed, and find people who will help you get there, because it can be really hard and intimidating to do on your own. And that's why it is so important, why I'm such a believer in women in politics. Like, I want that leaders' table filled with women, so that, and we love our men too, you know, we love them, but we've got to be representative. And when we're representative, we look like our country. And that means we need that power for women of color. We need young women, we need older women, we need the whole continuum to be able to make sure that our glide path, our life experience, and the real challenges and the joys are reflected. Because when you're at that table and have that vote, you can turn it into reality and change. And it's a slow progress, but these young women have it, and they are given a lot of messages that they are not good enough, that they don't look a certain way, that they are don't really have a place right now. And we have to be the ones that reach out and say, you do. And for you know, people who just feel like, and I hear it so often at town halls and in meeting with constituents, there is that, what can I do? And one of the most powerful things you can do is talk to your family, talk to your coworkers. If, you know, you're at your place of worship, help people understand your perspective and your knowledge around issues like pay equity. Bring this to them, because you are the trusted source. We can go on CNN and Instagram and TikTok and MSNBC and do every podcast, and it rings differently coming from an elected politician than someone you know and trust. And know the power of that to make change and find the community to be part of, to meet this moment. And that's the most heartening part for me right now, is seeing that coming together, seeing people realizing their ability to come together and push back, and push not only back. This isn't about defending the status quo. We don't want the status quo. This is about making change and progress.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, yes, using your voice and also lifting as we climb. 474 no more. Thank you so much, Whip Clark, for being here tonight. Thank you so much to all of the audience for joining us for this really important conversation. I just want to say, really could not be gathering here together at a more important time for our democracy, and also to commemorate this very, very important anniversary, and to think about the stakes and the potential for where we go from here. So take care, everybody. Have a good evening.
And thank you for your amazing work.